I'm trying to squeeze together two ideas. One of them is a narrative, personal narrative, like Sarah, which is my experience as an instrument maker in some way, or instrument desirer. But I have a problem. My problem is that my instruments are intangible. They're all just mathematics. I do DSP. I've been doing it since the 1970s. So what I do is, you call it simulation, but it really isn't simulation because I don't know what I'm simulating, so it can't be a simulation. But I do enactments in abstract spaces, which I then connect to the real world through performing with other musicians. So I work with virtuoso musicians and use their sound in real time and try to give them a new instrument. Luckily, they agree to this, some of them, yeah. So, and I've been having interesting experiences over the years, which is that in order to learn to play the instruments, because I play in real time, I don't just stand there, I actually do things. So it's kind of a duet, two people on one instrument, you might say. Not really, but I mean, that's kind of a way to describe it. I found that one of the aspects of learning to play was a kind of forgetfulness. I had to forget what the instrument was. I mean, what its description was, what its engineering, scientific, definitions. And I had to learn what it was as a musical instrument, which happened only over the time in playing and things like that. And I thought about that for a long time. It all came together a couple of years ago with an inside-out experience, which Sarah also has. I have an inside-out trombone, which doesn't exist in most everything I have. I mean, in the physical world, but and part of that inside-out trombone is George Lewis, who is in the physical world, so he's kind of the inspiration in a way. Was kind of a meditation on the issue of control, and I always felt that controls is such an ugly word because of the kind of political, social aspects of that word. And it's not the experience you have of instrument playing, which is a much more engaging experience, and not one in which it's obvious who's the master and who's the slave in the situation. I don't think clarinet players think of themselves as the master of the clarinet. And so it's really, I'm going to put a whole bunch of little stories out, and hopefully it'll fit in 10 minutes. But it started out, when I first came to STEIM, people kept coming up and saying, they're artists usually from the Rietveld, and they wanted to make music using a picture. And have this picture or a kind of a sequence of images in their head or on a piece of paper, a piece of film, or theater or something like that. And it used to puzzle me, probably because of my scientific background, because I used to think, well, how can you move something which is two-dimensional into something like sound, which is one-dimensional? And it's problematic. I still just can't do it. I can't map, because one of the aspects of pictures is that they have intrinsic geometrical relationships. I mean, this is not much of a picture, some detail, but imagine this is a picture in 2 dimensions, and I can rotate it, and you can see, continue to see, your brain really likes rotation. If I hold this and if it had a letter A, and I could say, well, imagine the A upside down, you can do that. So your brain has software built in for rotation, which is an aspect of 2 dimensions and not of 1 dimension. There's no rotation in 1 dimension. So this is, for me, a problem. How to describe a way of relating to sound, which is fundamentally 1-dimensional. It's lots of parameters, no question about that. There's lots of degrees of freedom, or whatever you want to call it, in sound. But there's nothing like a coordinated space, a higher dimensional space. And this I took as a kind of rule for a long time, that was like fundamental to understanding sound, that you have to just basically realize that sound is a 1-dimensional experience. But then as I started getting more mellow, I said, yeah, but folded into sound is some sort of higher dimensional experience. This is very abstract, but that's the way I think. So, in other words, you can think of sound as a kind of origami experience. In other words, there is something, we don't know where it is exactly yet, that's kind of our problem right now. There's a higher dimensional kind of experience, probably something about the way our brain is made, which has to be folded in order to be able to express the sound. Comes out as sound. I'm doing lots of complicated things here. Language, phonemes, morphemes, rhythm and poetry, all those things at once. And outcomes is a one-dimensional stream proved by the fact that, well, turn off one of the microphones, you can still understand me. It's one dimension. Got just pressure, that's all that comes out. But somehow folded into that is this higher structure, higher dimensional structure. And your job as a perceiver is to take the one-dimensional stream, or two of them, but one-dimensional stream, and unfold it. So music is a kind of example of how the musicians, composers, whatever they are, inventors, somehow are able to, sort of crush the complexity they have into this one-dimensional stream, and then you, as the perceiver, reconstruct it somehow. And this all makes sense with modern cognitive science, and it makes sense in the context of how it is that amateurs, let's say I'm an amateur clarinet player, like I touched one once. That's about it, right? And yet I can listen to a clarinet player and I can get a lot of stuff out of it. So we have this amazing ability to reconstruct somehow, amazing ability to reconstruct and to, using my spatial metaphors, to unfold out of the stream of sound the complexity that he's experiencing. The complexity meaning the music that he's experiencing, that he's transmitting. So I wanted to give you, this is kind of a pep talk or evangelism for an idea about instrument making, which I haven't seen realized, except you touched on it, I think. You're interested in this sort of thing, which is to have an instrument which adjusts itself to the experience, whatever that is. And so what I'm gonna, this is just a reiteration. I'm going to say the same sort of thing again. This came from my meditating on the inside-out trombone. As I had a Persian student, Irfan, who had made this really weird instrument in which he had like he had started out making a kind of mousy-driven or like finger-driven telephone amp in the art science department. And then I said, well, that's really great, but why don't you like make it more physical so people can see you perform it on stage. He made this really weird Rube Goldberg device, which was a stick you could hold like this, and it had several joints. He went through, and if you went like this, you could turn all of the joints, which are just controllers. So you could get rotational measurements in 3 or 4 places, but holding only at the end of it. So you can imagine in between, this is why I know graphics, because it's better for you to imagine. I'm holding onto this stick, and it's kind of a strangely articulated thing. And as you move it, you can adjust the angles, all the different angles. And out of this, he was able to create a graphic and a music. He made a kind of harp. Instead of going like this with the harp, he went like that with the harp. So, and this gave me the idea of the inside-out trombone, because I started thinking about, well, what's going on here? These simple little controllers. Each one of them is just a knob. There's like a knob here, knob here, knob here. Sometimes doubly articulated, because you might have a knob that actually has, like you can do in space, you can have a knob that has 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions in one point. That's not a problem in space. It's a problem on gear, but it's not a problem in 3-dimensional space. Another thing, as you go to higher dimensions, you get not things becoming more difficult, which if you're math phobic or math averse, this may seem counterintuitive. Most people think, well, geez, higher dimensions, that's harder, right? Like, what's the 4th dimension? Oh my God, the 4th dimension. Well, the example I always give to try to explain this is in the 4th dimension, there are no knots. Knots only exist in the 3rd dimension. In the 4th dimension, they all disappear. Your shoes come apart, And what this is saying is that sometimes the complexity is a problem of viewing reality from too small a perspective. In other words, when you squeeze things down to 1 dimension or 2 dimensions, let's say, you're actually making things harder to understand. Our natural existence is in 3 or higher dimensions, and we really feel comfortable understanding things in 3 dimensions. And when you squish it down to 2 dimensions, like language, or 1 dimension like language, and music, something like that, it gets really, 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 really complicated. And it's very natural and simple in higher dimensions. Now, Stephen Smale, mathematician at Berkeley, where I come from, he spent like 15 years of his life living in the 5th dimension, thinking about it all the time. And what's really cool in higher dimensions is that the relationships get more rich. In other words, in the 1 dimension, there's only like what's on this side and what's on that side. There's no rotation, can't do anything. All you can do is go like that. So you can do translation. You could do kind of like zooming, like you can imagine the line stretching, like an elastic band or something like that. But that's about it. In 2 dimensions, you get rotation. In 3 dimensions, you get really interesting results, which is that when you turn in, this is 2-dimensional rotation. We're used to that one. But in 3 dimensions, things disappear. So that's something that comes into existence in the higher dimension. In the 4th dimension, even more crazy things happen. But they're things that I think we're comfortable with because our body is used to it. Now here's the inside-out trombone idea, which is that the trombone is a nice electronic musical analog because it's just basically a slider. We like sliders in electronic music or knobs, something like that. Seems like a one-dimensional instrument if you forget the embouchure and just ignore that. Just think about it as just a sliding instrument. It seems like Nick Collins made a trompe-l'oeil kind of instrument once where he had just a kind of rotation measuring trick, and he was just using the slide of the trombone basically to turn one knob in his synthesis thing, and but it had a kind of beautiful power for the audience. But why this is worth thinking about is that. Which is what I learned from thinking about robotics in the context of playing the trombone, like a robot played the trombone. From a point of view of engineering, or from a point of view of a technician, you might say, the trombone is a one-dimensional controller. But from the point of view of the human body, how many dimensions of control are in doing this? In other words, when you just do this, when you pull something like that, how many dimensions are you actually involved in? Well, if you think of it just like in robotics, this is 7 dimensions. The wrist, the elbow, the shoulder. If you add them all together, it's like 7 dimensions or 7 degrees of freedom. Just to do that, just to do that. And it's what they call, in math, overdetermined. And what that means is that this point and this arm can get to the place in many, many different ways. So our bodies have been designed to be able to do the same thing in thousands of different ways. And you can imagine, like, if you're walking through the forest and you see an apple, and it's on the other side of that tree. The tree is here, and the apple. You can't do that, but you can do this. Okay, so we can reach and do all these complicated things because we have these higher dimensions of control. And the problem in electronic music is that we've been stuck with the description of electronic music that comes out of engineering, which is all very, very analytical and simple, and you might say one-dimensional, and not exactly. But I mean, it's a simplified description, when in fact what we need is a much higher dimensional, complicated description. Now here's where I'm supposed to play the examples, but I'll do that some other time. I've had a recent experience of trying to recover. I think that's a better word for control sometimes. What the issue of control is in music is the desire to do it again. When you get the instrument, you want to be able to do that thing you discovered again. So that's what the control issue is really about. It's about recovery. This is something they say in theater all the time. They don't say that in music, but that's the common expression in theaters. How do we recover this piece? How do we recover last night? Last night was fabulous. How do we do it again? Okay. So I was having one of those last night experiences because I did a concert with Evan Parker, and in the middle of the concert, something really magical happened, and Evan stopped playing, and the music kept going. And normally I'm playing very real time, and it's really in the moment, in the microsecond or millisecond kind of moment. And suddenly Evan was able to, and he I don't know if you know Evan, but he plays kind of circular breathing. He plays continuously. That's the characteristic of his style. Is he never stops, in a sense, playing when he's playing soprano. And suddenly he was able to pause for a long time, like 3 or 4 seconds, and then start again, and then pause. But the music was going on because it had gone through what I felt was a kind of inflationary process. Suddenly the music had inflated and filled the room and was playing by itself because of all the delays in my equipment, all the kinds of little delays, and the feedback delay of the room, which of course are very many. There are thousands of kinds of feedback because there's thousands of distances between me and the reflection on the wall. And at some point, a certain kind of phase transition had happened, and the sound was happening by itself. And I don't mean like just kind of like feedback kind of thing. It was just like the music just kept going on. the harmony continued, the mood continued, but it had this kind of lambient, floating kind of quality. Mostly because Evan didn't have to push anymore. He was suddenly sitting back, and I wanted, oh, how did this happen? I had no idea what happened. For years, I would listen, and I would not listen to the tape because it was kind of scary, scary because I couldn't have it again. Like, oh. And then last week I did it again. That's how it took years. And because I had a difficult situation where I was scared of the musicians. And so I took a chance to try to solve, it's a very complicated story, to solve the problem, and it happened again. But I knew what I was doing this time, so I was paying attention. And suddenly I was able to generate this phase change. And I think, for me, that's the archetypal experience of playing a musical instrument, which is that it's not so much about playing the notes, it's about playing the music, playing the musical experience. And even if you're playing the piano, in which everything seems very concrete in some way, very specific, there's a one-to-one relationship between gesture and note and idea or something like that, it's still, on the bigger scale in music, there's something else that's happening that you really want to get to, some sort of magical relationship. Sometimes something only the musician knows about, and we as audience members have to kind of, keep our ears as wide as possible to realize that it's really happening. But, so I'm suggesting for instrument builders, as you were as well, that part of the solution may be enabling this higher dimensional control in which the control is abstracted rather than concrete, rather than being about the descriptions, the technical descriptions or the musical descriptions, but about the experiential aspect of the performance. And it makes a lot of sense in my experience, since my stuff is so intangible. It's so abstract and so intangible. I know I don't want to play the parameters. They're not even musical parameters. They're purely mathematical parameters. They don't map even to normal musical values half the time. What I want to play is this thing that allowed me to create, special kinds of experience. Like, I don't know. To me, yeah. Okay. That's 10 minutes.